What is day 3 of the Lori-Vallow Daybell conspiracy to commit murder trial? So after Friday, Erica, you were inside the courtroom. You're with us to take us inside the courtroom today. After Friday, it was an explosive day. Lori, the defendant who was representing herself, got kicked out of court. What about today? Were there people anxiously awaiting to see what would happen next?
Oh, yeah, Andrea. When I showed up today, everyone had been inside. Typically, there's a line outside the courthouse until the doors open at 7:30 local time. And then there's another line inside. And they essentially have like 4 rows of where the public can come in and line up. And they were completely full by the time I arrived today, about an hour before we were set to start. So people I had heard were coming in just because they wanted to maybe witness something of what happened on Friday, which, as you said, Andrea, was Vallow Daybell being, taken out of the courtroom by a deputy after arguing with the judge. So certainly a huge moment throughout this trial that was outside the presence of the jury. But a lot of people showing up today did not get quite the scene that we saw on Friday. I would say things were a lot calmer in court today.
Sure.
There weren't many, head-butting moments. There were a couple, as there always seem to be with this case, but just a few. And today was pretty technical. We heard from a lot of investigators, a lot of people testifying to various evidence in the case. And, the case at hand, I should say, Andrea, is Lori-Vallow Daybell, accused of conspiring with her brother, Alex Cox, to try and kill a man named Brandon Boudreaux here in Arizona. Now, Boudreaux is Lori-Vallow Daybell's ex-nephew. He was once married to her niece. So that's where this whole case stems from. And of course, Andrea, there's a huge backstory here. We've covered this case for the past 5+ years, and that includes Lori-Vallow Daybell, convicted of killing her children, Tylee and JJ, as well as her role in the death of Tammy Daybell, her current husband, Chad Daybell's first wife. And just back in April here in Arizona, she was convicted of conspiring to kill her former husband. So she was sentenced to life in prison in Idaho. She's now playing out trials here in Arizona. And we have some big updates on that front. I understand the appeal in her Idaho case was officially filed today.
Right.
I know your team at KTVB got that paperwork. But I do want to point out, too, that, Andrea, today is June 9th, 2025. It's exactly 5 years to the day that investigators found Tylee and JJ's remains buried in Chad Daybell's backyard. So, of course, I remember covering that from here in Arizona. It was such a somber day, because I think some people maybe still had hope that they were hiding somewhere. There are dark doomsday thoughts at the core of this. But to me, thinking back on that, it really just points out how impactful all these crimes were, how many people were touched by the atrocities here, and just how long it's taken to get all of these cases and all these charges through the court system. So I just want to take a moment to reflect on that.
Absolutely. And just the heinous nature, the way that the two, bodies were found at the house, and underground, it was very difficult, I think, for people that was really the first time, even when you were suspicious and people had started to worry, obviously, that they wouldn't be found alive. Even, learning a lot more about the details about their deaths were, I think, really very, very difficult moments for a lot of us. And of course, we did hear all of that in the trial here in Idaho. And fortunately, in Arizona, fortunate for those jurors and for the people who have had to live through these cases, they don't bring that up, obviously, in front of the jurors there. These are isolated cases, and they only worry about that evidence, that's related to Brandon Boudreaux. But there are people sitting in that gallery who know very well that history, and who have lived it and who've been there. So I would imagine that today was, certainly on their minds, the anniversary, of course, of finding the children. So probably very difficult.
Yeah, and Andrea. Yeah, of course. And I'll point out one person in particular, Kay Woodcock. We've brought her up so many times before. She's the grandmother to JJ Vallow and the sister of Charles Vallow. And she's testified in all of Lori Vallow's trials before this. She's not expected to testify in this case, but she's been there to support Brandon Boudreaux. She's told us, time and time again, that they've lost so many family members over the course of these crimes. And they've essentially gained another family and the supporters that have come together to really rally behind the surviving members of this family. And the big difference with this case, too, is that Brandon Boudreaux is still alive. There was a shooting attempt at him, but he was not injured ultimately. And he's been testifying in this case. He's been in the courtroom each day. And, he wasn't this is the first day he was not on the stand, but certainly present. And I'll point out, Andrea, that at least one of the jurors kept looking at him during testimony today. So his presence is impactful in the courtroom, of course.
Yeah. So on Friday, as we left Friday and as the jurors went away for the weekend, they were really kind of laying that foundation of how a lot of this evidence is collected. You know, the cell phone data and location data, and we've heard about some of the bullet, evidence. But today it kind of came together in a sense of we started to understand, basically how they were using that evidence, right? How we knew kind of a little bit more, I guess, about trajectory and about where that vehicle went, where the Jeep went, things like that kind of came together today, if I understand.
Yes. And, it's interesting because with the delays in this case stemming back from last week and the week before when Vallow Daybell claimed to be sick, that caused some significant delays, at least a few days here in this trial. And, everyone kind of wanted to get this going. But we understand that the state had to call some witnesses maybe out of order than what they had originally intended. We know people are coming in from out of town. So we saw that in a way unfold this morning, where we started with the testimony of a guy from Idaho who does window tinting. And his significance essentially was to come in and say, hey, I had this correspondence with someone with a 480 number. Eventually, investigators were able to link that. They studied cell phone data from Lori and her brother Alex, and they were able to kind of connect the dots that way. But this guy essentially came on and said, yeah, I had this Jeep come in. They showed images of the Jeep. We've seen this Jeep many times now in various photographs stemming from this investigation. And he said, yeah, they asked me to add additional tint onto these Jeeps. So the reason this is significant is because the state is alleging that Alex Cox drove this car from Idaho to Arizona. And this was a vehicle where Alex Cox was almost lying in wait, is the word they used to describe this, to shoot at Brandon Boudreaux as he came to his Gilbert home. So that's why I think they're bringing this guy in. I know sometimes if you watch Law and Order, things like that, you might be, wow, this is such a specific little detail. And you have to bring in all these people to, almost tell their part of the story. It can't just be an investigator saying, here's everything we found. So to your point, Andrea, this was really about laying stuff down today. And when they asked about, the impact the tinting could have on the window, this is what he said.
So if someone was laying or sitting in the back of this Jeep and you tried to walk by and look in there, you wouldn't be able to see it.
Objection. Speculation.
Overruled.
Having worked on these cars and seen what this looks like, are you familiar with whether or not you can see someone inside the vehicle with that dark of tint?
Yes, definitely.
So from your personal experience, you are telling us that with the 5% and then the additional factory tint, you would not be able to see into the back of that Jeep.
Broad daylight, you can't see in.
So interesting that Lori got in the defendant who was representing herself. Not many objections. You don't hear her object very often, but got in her very own objection. Of course, it was overruled by the judge in this case. But it's kind of interesting to hear when she does that, because it's just unusual.
Yeah.
But the tint, I mean, obviously trying to show, right, that he would have known Alex, but if he didn't see Alex, I think that's clearly, trying to point out that just because he knew him, he wouldn't have known who it was. I mean, he wasn't likely able to see him at all. And so I think that's a, easy, valid point to make. But to your point earlier, it's interesting because it's very technical and very specific, and maybe something that someone wouldn't even question or think about. But this goes to show the meticulous nature of the prosecution, trying to, factor in all of those details and make sure that the jury hears that complete picture.
Absolutely. And as I said, this is someone from Idaho, Andrea. It sounds like they've had to coordinate this guy a couple times to try and, get here. We understand some of these witnesses were supposed to be called last week. So, it takes a lot for people to come in, even if their testimony, maybe takes less than 20 minutes. I think he was on the stand. If I recall, Lori didn't ask any, cross of him. We do see her come up and cross. But to your point, too, she doesn't issue many objections. We more so hear that from the state. And part of that is because she's representing herself and oftentimes kind of, wades away from, what she should be talking about and, doesn't have maybe the, legal training that a lawyer has to navigate some of these court situations. But I thought his testimony was interesting, and it does really drive home the point that exactly what Brandon Boudreaux testified to is that, yes, he can recognize who Alex Cox is, but he could not see into the back of that car, nor could he see the car as, who was in the car as it drove by him, essentially trying to get away from the scene.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Which, yeah, I think obviously very, very important points, very small, and yet important points that the prosecutor is trying to lay out. And it's interesting that when you talk about them being called in different order, you have to wonder if that doesn't kind of mess with the prosecution strategy. Not that it all won't be laid out, but if you think of a trial, I mean, it's oftentimes, trying to tell a story. They're trying to piece together a timeline, and they often have a strategy in terms of what information, when it's going to be brought up. And a lot of the testimony, because the experts can only testify to that very, specific lane of travel, if you will, that they are, authorized or allowed to or have direct access to. And so sometimes they depend on each other, and that'll come up later when we hear some of the testimony. We hear pieces of the testimony or pieces of evidence, but you're clearly going to need to follow up and have other people fill in some of the other blanks. And so I wonder if that's difficult for them to have some of these people out of order, and if that is difficult for the jury even, or if that makes it a little more challenging to put all the pieces together the way that the prosecution hopes that the jury will.
Yeah, and every time they call someone out of order, the judge advises the jury that that's what they're doing. So they have a heads up that maybe this isn't chronological. Maybe they're not getting it this way.
Right.
And I think part of the tactic today was, again, this is my assessment of what's going on. I didn't talk to the prosecutor about this directly, but
Sure.
they call some of these witnesses that are, have short little snippets to say. And, some of them, again, traveling from out of state. So I think the prosecutor kind of wants to get them done. And we left off on Friday hearing from case agent, Detective Ryan Pillar with the Gilbert Police Department here in Arizona.
Right.
And they essentially, everyone was expecting maybe he'd continue his testimony this morning, but that didn't happen. They were advised again that people were taken out of order. And I think some of what Detective Pillar testified to, as we'll get to what he says later in the day, as we continue, discussing this tonight. But some of the things that came up in testimony this morning were things that Detective Pillar brought up in his testimony later on. So I think maybe they were trying to, again, lay that foundation before they continued on with his testimony as well. In addition to just, the travel and time, trying to get people in and out, so to speak, for, because Detective Pillar, he's the case agent. He's been sitting at the table with the prosecutor the whole time. He has to be there. So, he'll be there regardless. But, speaking of lanes and travel and cars, like that's who we hear from next is a DEA agent who is part of, that's drug enforcement, the license plate reader program. And we knew this was coming. This came up in the state's opening statement that, you're going to hear from a guy who knows license plate readers, because we actually clocked this Jeep in question coming into Arizona. We found October 1st in Holbrook, which is a community maybe about a 3-hour drive away from Phoenix, maybe a little more. It's up northeast of the valley, which is where we call ourselves here in Arizona. And that's where an interstate is. So we start to hear this interesting testimony that, the DEA has these cameras in place along, essentially what they find to be drug routes. So they, he discusses this programming that they have that kind of flags license plates. And if you have a number, you can go back and search and see if the car has any hits. So that's essentially what happened here. And of course, as other investigators testified, and from testimony last week, we know that this is, a Jeep Wrangler with Texas plates. And that vehicle has been linked to Lori-Vallow's family. And it's also the Jeep that was linked to this case, one that did not have a back tire at the time of the alleged crime here. So what did you think about that testimony, Andrea? Again, very in the weeds, but lays foundation.
Sure. Yeah. But exactly. And I do think you have to know that. I mean, that the question there is begged of, are we sure that Jeep, again, it just furthers, solidifies where the Jeep was and who the Jeep belonged to. We know who the Jeep belonged to. That's really not in question. And so then this gives them a way to really map it. I mean, quite literally map. That gives you timing, that gives you location, and it shows that, that movement of that Jeep from where we believe it was to where we believe it ended up. And it just verifies that along the way. Of course, there was some question about whether or not, how many of those cameras, how often along that route they were able to see this car. Are there other areas that they could have checked? But I think again, a very straightforward, but a necessary piece to confirm, validate that claim that the Jeep moved from Idaho, was in Idaho and in Arizona at the time that the prosecution says that it was. So it didn't seem to call in, really wasn't very much to question there, I think.
Although Lori-Vallow Daybell tried, because, you know, how she gets up on cross-examination.
Sure.
And some of these investigators, you see the nature how she asks questions. Sometimes her tone is a little different, but essentially she's trying to poke holes in whatever testimony is coming out. And we've described before, Andrea, that it sounds like she just sometimes tries to throw things at the wall and see what sticks, or, you know, really drives, well, why didn't you do this very, very, very specific thing? And when it, you know, is typically not what happens. And we did see a little bit of that when she got up on cross-examination here to, you know, as the DEA agent was testifying. So take a listen to that.
And how many license plate readers do you have in Gilbert, Arizona?
I am not sure on how many we exactly have.
Do you have any?
Yes, we do.
There's one on Gilbert Road, isn't there?
That I'm not sure. We have over 11,000 cameras that feed into the diesel platform.
Okay. What about in Mesa, Arizona? Are you aware of any in Mesa, Arizona?
I am unaware how many cameras that we have in Mesa, Arizona. We do have quite a few cameras, LPR cameras in Arizona.
And so of all those cameras that you have along this way, when this incident happened in Gilbert, Arizona, you don't have any other pictures of this Jeep? Is that correct?
No, but there's several reasons why there may or may not be. A lot of times we do have software and hardware issues with our LPR cameras, so they will be down at times, depending on speed, how old the camera is. Sometimes speed and the amount of traffic will also have a bearing on whether or not an image is captured. And then there's ways to defeat LPR cameras as well.
There are ways to defeat them?
I'm sorry?
There are ways to defeat them?
Yes.
Interesting. Your Honor, object to that and move to strike defendant's comments.
The jury should disregard.
Interesting, which is what she said. And interesting that here we're getting a little snippet or a little view of what we saw a lot of in Lori Vallow Daybell's last trial, which is that, you know, the little comments, the little side remarks following questioning. But that was, you know, so we haven't seen that a lot, but that was, you know, interesting, I guess. Interesting to hear her say interesting.
Yeah.
But
well, and it just shows, again, the lack of experience she has in a courtroom. I mean, she claimed when she wanted to represent herself, she said she had copious experience in a courtroom, and that being her previous criminal trial in Idaho, as well as family court cases here in Arizona, and I understand possibly in Texas as well. You know, it goes back a long ways, her history.
Right.
But yeah, that's her experience essentially, is cases where she's been on trial or has been involved in a you know, family court case. So not exactly law school.
No, and he talks about LPRs, the license plate reader cameras. And so, again, it's interesting in terms of her making a point of that. And you have talked before about, well, I think some of the information she presents seems to contradict what the point she's trying to make. And so, you know, he's saying, no, we didn't see a lot of those. And yet he also is explaining where potentially somebody could have done something to try to alter the license plate or try to keep it from being read, which wouldn't really help her case. You know, that would actually potentially cause people to doubt that information, that it wasn't somewhere else, you know.
And that's not been something that's been brought up by the state, just to be clear, too. That's, you know, it's almost like she's overarching some of the points that the state is trying to make, which, again, as you've stated before, Andrea, it's hard to tell where she's trying to go with some of her questioning, but that's where we're at.
Yeah,
and
that was
you know, the
another
next
example.
Oh, go ahead.
No, that's just another example of that. But,
yeah. And we see more, you know, of the back and forth as we get into the testimony later in the day. We hear from a few other people laying, you know, more foundational stuff, forensic analysts, or forensic scientists, I should say, who speak to, you know, their role in, you know, we received this swab or we collected this piece. But mainly we heard from, you know, this afternoon, it was the two investigators. And one is an officer. She was the first on the scene. She's since retired from the Gilbert Police Department, but Marianne Robb is her name. And then we
Yes.
later hear from Detective Ryan Pillar, who's currently with the Gilbert Police Department and, as I mentioned, the case agent. But I think Officer Robb's testimony was really interesting, and we'll show, portions of her testimony in just a minute, Andrea, but she stands out to me because I've seen her before in body camera footage.
Right,
This stemming
right,
back to
exactly.
early January or maybe February. It was early 2019 when Charles Vallow, Lori Vallow Daybell's former husband, they were married at the time. There was a whole incident where she maybe took his car. They had some issue, and he
Yes.
called police and was following up with them saying, she's not well, she needs help. And it's just hard to think back to those times because he was very much alive. He was ringing an alarm bell, and I don't think anyone could have anticipated how things would unfold.
Sure.
Of course, we've mentioned before he was killed by Alex Cox, Lori's brother, back in July 2019. Lori now convicted in that case, and her brother Alex, I'll mention, cannot be charged in this case or any other case because he died in December 2019. We do hear a little bit more about that today as well. So, I think her testimony coming up as an investigator, as someone who responded to that scene, was interesting, compelling, but also more of the same that we heard from some of these other investigators who responded and talked to Brandon Boudreaux that day. What did you think?
Yeah, I think again, nothing earth-shaking, nothing shocking, nothing that we didn't expect to see. But again, furthering, I think, just one more voice in this conversation, and somebody who did have a very close view of this and was able to talk to Brandon, able to talk to kind of again knows the totality of the story. And so I think it just one more layer of evidence and of information that just continues to stack up in this case, and just exactly like the prosecutor would expect it to, and what that case that they're trying to build. And to your point, I think all of these investigators and Brandon himself, I mean, they don't get flustered. They're very straightforward. They respond very well. That you can sometimes see people. In fact, there's trials going on right now that people are watching in other parts of the country, and lots of chatter about that, where some of the officers seem less experienced, or they don't answer questions well, or their own testimony causes confusion or frustration. We don't see that here. I mean, all of these people have been very good on the stand and what seem to be very credible witnesses, which obviously I think helps the prosecution tremendously.
Of course. And sometimes we hear, the prosecutor talks with their witnesses before they prepare for this. It's not out of the blue.
Sure.
They don't just show up one day. But I do agree with you, Andrea, that all of these investigators who we've seen take the stand so far seem to, be very versed in what they're talking about, well prepared. And I would imagine not anyone's first time in front of a jury. So it sounds like they have a lot of experience doing this kind of work. And, at least this particular officer, I think she said she was with law enforcement in Arizona for more than 30 years. So she's, certainly not her first rodeo. And to your point, they seem very, very credible. And especially when it's just straightforward. And we've talked about this before, that some of the grander details of this case, the dark doomsday religious beliefs, everything with Charles Vallow, the prosecution's been very careful not to bring in any of those details. So these people are, again, speaking to very specific portions of this investigation. And I think that makes it maybe more tangible or more easy for the jury to digest when there isn't all the backstory, even as interesting as the backstory could be and as damning as it could be in some ways. So it's interesting to see, kind of straight and narrow testimony. And that's exactly what we saw with Officer Robb, and I'll point out to Andrea that every time we do hear from someone, again, it might be a little repetitive, some of this testimony, but I do think it sits in with me to hear just how close this case could have been to a death. The bullet seemed to be really close to hitting there, and we, learned some additional details about maybe the trajectory of that. But Officer Robb was able to speak to Brandon's demeanor once she responded to the scene that day. Again, she was the first officer on the scene, and this is what she had to say.
He was kind of bewildered. He didn't know what exactly happened. He was very quiet and concerned, and didn't know how to react on this because he had no idea what in the world happened. This car with this something, the window falls out of the car when he opens the door, and he's just kind of bewildered on like what in the world took place just a few minutes ago.
When you came back after you had showed him the bullet hole, went and made the call and returned, did you see a change in his demeanor?
Yes, I did.
What did you note then?
Well, I noticed when I showed him the bullet hole and all, he's like, first of all, he said, well, that definitely isn't a BB gun. And I explained, no, it's not. He then says, I need to sit down because I was asking him some more questions. He goes, I just need a minute. I just need to sit down. I asked him if he wanted a chair. He says, no, I just need a minute. So I just had him sit down right there in the driveway area and just let him gather himself for a few minutes.
Did you notice anything with his hands?
He was quite shaken.
So you saw his hands physically shaking?
Yes.
I think this is super important for her to be able to explain that shift, because that's something that I know that the defense has certainly tried to, Lori herself has talked about kind of how the way Brandon explained the incident, the way that Brandon explained the car, the color of the Jeep, and trying to discredit some of that initial information that he gave police, and I think drawing into question, trying to maybe suggest that he didn't see it well or he wasn't sure of what happened. And I know because his first statements to the Detective Robert, Officer Rob, was that maybe it was a paintball gun, maybe it was a BB gun. And I think we have to also recognize human nature. You hear a loud noise, and I don't think most of us assume, if something goes into your window, I don't think most of us immediately jump to, I think someone just shot at me. I think that we do go through the less, I guess, more something less targeted, I think. And I think that's human nature, but I think it helps then to kind of explain with people like her, kind of explaining how, as he started to process and kind of get more information himself, how that shifted. I think that starts to make a lot more sense to people, that it wasn't that he was confused. It wasn't that he wasn't clear. It's just that he was in shock and was trying to piece it together himself, right? In the moment,
Absolutely.
in real time. And it's difficult in hindsight
Absolutely.
to, armchair quarterback that, I guess. And I think that that's a great example or, good job of kind of explaining that and helping put that in perspective so that it becomes less discreditable, I guess.
Yeah, especially that before and after. Once you see that what the state, I think is presenting as concrete evidence as a bullet hole in this vehicle.
Sure.
And, Brandon himself testified to, when you go through something traumatic like that, your brain wants to protect you. And I think it helps to maybe think that, of course, no one's shooting at me. Maybe it is just a paintball. You do go through that process, and you're absolutely right that it's human nature. And I don't think many of us would be able to discern exactly what's happening in the moment there. And it's impressive almost that he had the wherewithal to even call 911 and call to get help. And they came and just started piecing this together. And, something Officer Rob said she did too, is after seeing that bullet hole, we understand that there were other Gilbert officers out looking for this possible shooter. And she called, she testified to this today, called called someone who was looking and said, you're looking for a real shooter here. Like, this is a gun, this is a crime. It's not, we understand that maybe we thought it was something else, but no, the evidence, is pointing us in this direction here. So that's, essentially the crux of her testimony, but that did not mean Lori Vallow Daybell did not try to poke holes at that. And, Andrea, it's interesting because I think we saw Vallow Daybell take maybe a more mild approach or a little toned down than what we typically see with investigators. What did you think?
Yeah, she did. And I wonder, what's that dynamic? She did seem a little bit softer. I think that's how I would describe that. And you're right. She has been, at moments, it's interesting because at moments she's been almost meek with certain professionals or certain law enforcement folks. I think mostly the investigators. And it was in the last trial that we saw that even more. And so I wasn't sure what to expect, how she would approach this officer. And you're right, I think it was a pretty gentle approach.
Yeah. And one of the things she brought up, though, and we've heard her try to, kind of get at this with other investigators who have taken the stand, is that she has questions about the trajectory. She has questions about whether it was a bullet at all. She brings up, it seems like every time, Brandon saying to some effect that it was a paintball gun or maybe that he saw a little boy. Officer Rob said she doesn't recall anything like that being a little boy, but in prior testimony, we thought maybe just kids being kids is something Lori said. So again, she's trying to poke in different places. And I don't know if there's a fully formed, point formed
Right.
in some of that.
Yeah.
But we did see that specifically today when Officer Rob was talking with her about the trajectory and what she was trying to do to discern, exactly where that bullet went. So take a listen.
And then when you looked at the Tesla and you put your pen in the Tesla and kind of wiggled it around, were you looking for the projectile in there?
I was looking for the projectile, and I was looking for the trajectory of how that bullet went in, so I could figure out where in the vehicle it might, if it did exit, where it could have exited.
Like to see if the hole went through possibly into the car?
No, I'm just looking to see which way the bullet was going in the car, so if we can find it, where in the vehicle it could have been.
Okay. So did you, is that kind of a typical thing that you stick your pin in there to find trajectory?
Yes, ma'am.
And you didn't think that could do anything to dislodge any of the projectiles or anything like that?
No, ma'am.
Did you find any large projectiles within that hole?
I did not.
And you didn't find any of the projectiles, is that correct? You didn't extract them out of there?
That's correct. No, I did not.
Someone did that later.
I don't know.
Okay. And so did you figure out the trajectory with your pen?
I could see which way it went into the vehicle.
So, I think, again, she's maybe trying to draw some, maybe trying to show that she's not clear or they didn't maybe have definitive information, but I'm not sure that worked well. I didn't think that
No.
seemed to, didn't seem to fluster the officer for sure. And I'm not sure that we got any meaningful information out of that cross.
No, and I think when she says you used a pen to do this,
Right.
she was like, "Yep." There was she didn't waver in her response, and I don't know. I'm not an investigator. I don't check things for trajectory, but yeah, I think it seems like investigators use a lot of different tools and a lot of different methods to try and determine things, especially during the early steps of an investigation. But she really walked through, I think, as you said, Andrea, very, very clearly, what her role was on the scene. And once her testimony wrapped up, this was actually the first time we heard a jury question. This is something we can do here in Arizona. Jurors can, if they have a question for a certain witness, they can write it out and essentially give it to the judge and the sides, read through and decide what could be asked. And eventually the judge will read the question. But we saw that this was the first time this happened. Compared to our last trial here in Arizona, we saw quite a few jury questions. So it makes you wonder, how this jury is paying attention, how the witnesses are being presented. I think there's a lot of, things that could be derived by whether or not they ask questions. And, this one was pretty interesting. So before we discuss further, let's go ahead and play it out so people can hear for themselves what the jury asked.
Are there any questions for this witness from jury? Write down your question if you have a question. Pass it forward.
I wrote it down.
Well, would it be easier or harder to hit a closer target?
Actually, if you have a sight, if you're using a scope, it's harder.
All right. Any follow-up based on that question first from the defense?
No, Your Honor.
From the state?
And would the movement of the object you're striking also play into the difficulty of hitting it?
It would be the moving of the vehicles. Also, it depends on whoever is doing the shooting with the rifle. Do they have a rest where they can shoot and everything? Meaning a rest, meaning you put your gun on a stable platform and you're able to shoot where there's when the recoil happens, the gun does not jump. If you're doing it freehand, then a lot of times the gun will kind of go up the recoil and your gun would kind of go in an upward direction.
So if a person is shooting a moving target using a gun that doesn't have a stable platform, the recoil of the rifle could also impact the ability to hit the target.
That is correct. If they're aiming here, a lot of times without the rest, it might just kind of go up just a hair and miss its actual target.
So that question actually gave us quite a bit of information. She certainly knows her stuff, and she knows all about the way that
She
the
testified to
firearm
being
works.
an avid hunter. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And I mean, I think that question could have been an easy yes. And then, of course, with that follow up, that extra question there, I think gave a lot of information about, and to your point about how close this could have come and why, they could have very easily, that shooter, believed to be Alex Cox, alleged to be Alex Cox, how, given the movement of the car and the nature of being inside a car himself, likely without, we're not talking about in a hunting stand or with that, the way that he's holding the weapon could be a major factor, how close it could have come to Brandon, but also how even with good aim, right? I mean, like they aiming at Brandon still could have missed the target by that little bit, which I think, again, absolutely without saying it directly in this instance, but just furthers and validates what has been alleged by the prosecution in terms of,
Yes.
how direct and how intentional that shot likely was.
Absolutely. And, pointing out, Andrea, that the bullet hole in the Tesla, and we've seen this, the images of that hole
Right.
in
Sure.
testimony, and it's right above the driver's side window. So as she's saying, when she said, yeah, sometimes things can tilt up when you're in these certain circumstances, that clicked in my head that, okay, this bullet hit above where Brandon's, head and body would have been in the vehicle. So I think that was an excellent juror question and gleaned a lot more information than maybe, the state or defense tried to bring out or not bring out from this particular witness. So it was interesting.
Exactly.
And yeah, I don't know. Again, it speaks to just how attentive the jury might be and what sort of things might be spinning in their brain as they're listening to some of this testimony. And, it was maybe a little surprising that they didn't ask any questions during some of the prior investigators. I know, we keep hearing things about the July incident without any backstory, which we know to mean the shooting death of Charles Vallow that involves Lori and her brother Alex, but they aren't following up on that. Even when, there was testimony saying that, there are multiple cases that could be connected here that Brandon maybe provided details for. So to me, I said, okay, this is interesting that the jury's picking up on, something like this or want to know more, I guess, hunting type questions from this particular witness. Yeah. So it was interesting to see. And as I mentioned, Andrea, this jury, watching them, sometimes they're rubbing their eyes. Like, I think some of these witnesses have been pretty long on the stand. Sometimes that's elongated by cross-examination. Sometimes the state just has a lot of things they need to get to and get through with a certain witness. But there was one in particular, and I said it at the top of our show today, who kept looking at Brandon. And I, wonder if that particular juror is thinking, listening to this testimony about this attempt on his life and looking at him as he's digesting, the testimony. So I think that's interesting. And I think Brandon's presence is, impacting them anyway. And that's what we heard before with Kay Woodcock in her first jury trial here in Arizona, that some of the jurors felt Kay was very compelling and just felt for her sitting in that courtroom. So definitely something to continue watching.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And the rest of the day really was, continued on this path of some of this very specific evidence. We've talked about the license plate reader. We've talked about the trajectory and the how close the bullet was. So what other kind of evidence did we hear this afternoon?
So back on the stand this afternoon was Detective Ryan Pillar. Even the judge gets that wrong in the courtroom sometimes, but he's back on the stand and, essentially picking up where he left off on Friday. And he's speaking about gunshot residue. They talk a bit about DNA. And again, we heard some expert testimony or people who have, work in those fields speak earlier about some of these things. So again, just connecting those dots. And he also talked a lot about cell phone data and then where they felt they needed to bring in the FBI to really, dive deeper into this investigation. And we later learned that it was ultimately Gilbert and Chandler police that, went to the FBI to kind of loop everybody in to get everyone on the same page here. But I think what was interesting about some of this testimony, Andrea, is, he walks us through, quite a few things here, including what it was like to eventually track down the Jeep. The Jeep Wrangler, again, associated with Lori and her brother, connected to her family. The Jeep was ultimately found in Rexburg, Idaho, which is where we know Lori and Alex were living. That's where Chad Daybell was living. They went there to be closer to Chad Daybell. At least that's what investigators have said. That's, the whole point of this. And they eventually, the Rexburg investigators eventually impound the Jeep. And Detective Pillar essentially walks through all the different things they did to like pull different samples, pull different things, how they tested certain things. So this was, really interesting, I thought. And we'll get back to the Jeep in a minute because Lori has some issues with the Jeep. She really hones in on, some of the Jeep color questions. So we'll get to that momentarily. And we'll also get to some of the cell phone records momentarily. But I want to point out that, we talk about DNA. And we understand there were DNA samples pulled from this Jeep. And then we also learned today that there was a DNA sample pulled from a blood blot, I believe it was, from Alex Cox. Now, he died in December 2019 here in Arizona. The medical examiner said it was natural causes. That investigation was, opened a little further by Gilbert police because, given all the other deaths surrounding, Lori and Chad, they were wondering if there was something more to this story. Ultimately, they closed their case and agreed with the medical examiner's findings. So natural causes, that's the listed cause. But it was pretty sudden, especially amid all of the other criminal activity that was going on at that time. But essentially, when he died, Detective Pillar seemingly was present for the autopsy and, was able to pull this sample, and he said they pulled it to essentially compare to the DNA found in the Jeep. But what he did not testify to is whether or not it was a match. So I wonder if that's something we'll hear from another investigator. He didn't say there wasn't, but he didn't say there was either. So I clocked that. It was almost like you're getting close, but there wasn't that nail in the coffin, so to speak. And the same thing with gunshot residue. He said that they, got certain samples of that from behind the Jeep. He talked, kind of walked through that process. But we also didn't hear whether or not there was any confirmation that would connect Lori's brother or anyone else involving the gunshot residue. He also indicated that there wasn't any fingerprints found on the Jeep, but he did say there were DNA samples and GSR, the gunshot residue. So what do you think about, connecting those dots, but maybe not connecting them one string further?
Yeah, I have to expect that there will be somebody, likely tomorrow, that's going to be the one who testified that did the actual testing, who will be able to then, show those results. And again, I think it just goes to the officer being able to speak to specifically his involvement. And so then the next piece will be to tie that together. I have to believe that that's coming very soon.
Yes, and we expect other investigators to take the stand possibly tomorrow, sometime early this week is the expectation. So I think you're right. I think we will, this isn't the last we've heard of some of these things. No. But the other big thing that he pointed out today, I think goes to these cell phone records. He's able to connect, certain dots with Lori's phone and Alex's phone. And the interesting storyline is that there's this track phone that they connect to Alex Cox. And that's essentially a burner phone, one that was, I think we'll learn more about that once we hear from maybe the FBI and some other analysts. But ultimately, this data that they're pulling in this investigation pointed them right back to none other than Chad Daybell. Take a listen.
And does it show the activation date of September 26th of 2019?
Yes.
And does that also contain a print-off of all of the call detail records for that track phone number 304-960-5998?
Yes, it does.
Fate will move to admit 180.
Foundation.
All right. 180 is admitted.
When you looked at the call detail records, did they reflect that this phone was used from September 26th when it was activated until only October 2nd?
That is correct.
After October 2nd, was there any other phone calls made or received by this phone?
No, that phone was no longer seen or activated after that date.
Is this the phone number we're talking about, the 304-960-5998?
Yes.
When you looked through these call detail records, is there only one number that ever calls this track phone?
Yes,
Is that phone number the only number that ever calls it? 515-402-0143?
that is correct.
Is that the number that we previously heard Detective Nate Duncan testify as being associated to Chad Daybell?
That is correct, yes.
Looking at these call detail records, does this track phone, the 304 number, call only one number itself?
Yes,
And is that number that is called by this track phone the 515-402-0143 number associated with Chad Daybell?
yes,
So every call on this is either made by Chad Bell to this or to Chad Daybell.
that is correct.
So let's talk really quickly about Chad Daybell. Of course, we know that he is, as I said, Lori-Vallow Daybell's current husband, her fifth. And his name has come up now a couple of times in this trial, but he has not been charged in this case. Is that correct?
No, he has not, but we understand that the Gilbert Police Department maybe submitted charges for him, but it's something that our county attorney did not continue on to prosecute. But as we heard, there are some elements of this case that are still open. So, remains to be seen what might be coming next. But as of right now, they did not believe, if I'm, again, remembering correctly, because I believe there were also charges submitted in the Chandler case. And typically when they decline to prosecute in an instance, it's because there might not be enough evidence or might not be something. It doesn't mean necessarily that someone wasn't involved or was involved, but that's essentially where the case is now. Lori is the only person charged in this case. And Chad Daybell, again, as we know, Andrea, just to remind people, he's on Idaho's death row because he's already been convicted for crimes connected to all of this. So that's where he is now. But of course, it's something that we've heard his name come up many times here.
Right. And it's just interesting, to hear that come up and I think that the question certainly gets asked, I know, in different groups but it also does just tie to her. This is a link. He is a direct link, 1 degree of separation from her. So, I don't think that is a problem for the jurors. I don't imagine that that's concerning, but instead just simply shows that they were together. Lori was with him, and again, very much connected to everything that was going around related to Alex Cox and this Jeep. Everything turns or ties right back to the defendant.
Absolutely. And, I'll point out that Chad Daybell's name, as we said, has been coming up a lot. There was testimony earlier, and it came up that he is Lori-Vallow Daybell's current husband. And, but I think in this particular instance, we hear it was connected to Chad Daybell. They didn't really give the jury background today on who Chad Daybell is. Of course, they've essentially established this, but I do wonder if that could maybe be confusing to just kind of hear his name thrown out, Chad Daybell, and then, that's it. But they also, in this case, she's Lori Daybell versus, that's State versus Lori Daybell. So I think there, are parallels drawn there. And, we go through the rest of his testimony. He, finishes his direct examination. As you said, Andrea, we were expecting to hear, more investigators and possibly some other witnesses essentially take the baton from where he left off and kind of continue, with some of the other evidence that comes out of this investigation. But then we have Lori go up on cross-examination. And, we see more of the same tactics that we've seen her do before in, her previous trial here in Arizona. And things at times do get a little feisty. So what did you make of her demeanor with Detective Pillar compared to some of the other witnesses today?
I definitely think this was the first thing. I already described her as being very calm, very mild, I think, with Officer Rob. I think this is the time where she, got a little bit frustrated. I think you saw her get a little bit more bitey. I think maybe, I'm not sure the right word to use, but I definitely thought that the demeanor, and again, I think that seems to come with frustration. It seems that is the more that she essentially can't, there's something there that she can't do what she wants to with it. I think that starts to come out. I think you start to see her frustration, exasperation in some ways. But it's always interesting to see. It is a shift. And I think her shifts in demeanor are noticeable. We certainly see them. I can't imagine the jury doesn't see them as well. And so I wonder how that, how that factors into what they're thinking about all that's going on.
Absolutely. And especially, an elongated line of questioning from her.
Yeah.
Sometimes she'll ask the
Sure.
same question in a different way over and over. And we saw that particularly when she's really
Yeah.
fixated on the color of the Jeep. Take a listen.
Yes.
And what color did Mr. Boudreaux say the Jeep was when he was with Officer Marianne Robb?
When he was with Officer Robb, he described it as a green colored Jeep.
And what was the color of the Jeep that was seen by witnesses in the neighborhood?
It was referred to as different colors. What I surmised it to be was a darker colored Jeep Wrangler.
So did you hear dark blue?
I do not remember specifically hearing dark blue, but I know that color has been brought up.
And is it your understanding that the color that Brandon pulled up on his phone to show the officers was camo green? Is that correct?
That's what was discussed by Officer Robb, but I was not privy to that actual conversation, and there was no supplement that I saw that indicated that.
So as the case agent, you did not watch the body cam with Officer Robb?
I watched all body-worn camera from this case.
And so in the body cam, you did not see him actually show it to Officer Robb and Officer Bullock that were standing there?
Not that I recall, but again, I watched many hours of body-worn camera footage, but I do not recall that specifically. No, I do not.
Would you like to see it to refresh your recollection?
If we want to take the time to watch that. But I'm also not disagreeing that it very well may have been said or shown to be a camo green.
So when is the first time you wrote in all of your reports that it was a gray Jeep? So where did you glean that information that the Jeep was gray?
The gray Jeep came about from my contact with the Chandler Police Department on October 9th.
So Brandon never told you it was a gray Jeep, is that correct?
I do not recall him ever describing it in the initial contacts as a gray Jeep, no.
And none of the neighbors ever called it a gray Jeep also, is that correct?
Not to me, no.
So if you've watched any sort of, any of the true crime information, if you've read police reports, of course, you and I have both covered crime in courts for a long time. I worked at a law enforcement agency for a long time. To have different colors of vehicles, to have that be described differently between different witnesses or even the same witness multiple times is certainly not uncommon at all. And even if it's just, kind of like the game of telephone where I say one thing, I say it's gray, and then that gets changed to green unintentionally or, vice versa. She is adamant about this. I know she has brought this up with multiple witnesses. I think at some point she's actually doing herself a disservice because it seems like when that's all you have and you keep going back to that and it doesn't seem to go anywhere. I think that works against you in the jurors' minds.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, and I would say, Andrea, that, looking at some of the images they're showing of the Jeep, now we've seen it from a license plate reader, from the Chandler investigation, from Gilbert investigation, from Rexburg. Like we've seen different iterations of this Jeep. And, another reporter sitting near me today said, looking at them, they look different in some of the different images. So I think this gray green can be easily construed. And especially as Brandon has testified to, there was a lot happening in that moment. So I agree with you that I don't think anyone is, I think what Lori is trying to do, again, I don't talk to her. We are just, I'm speculating what she might be attempting here is to try and cast out and say, well, how do you know any of, trying to just poke a hole wherever she can. And I agree that I don't know if it's really effective with this jury. And, 2 points I want to make, Andrea, before we wrap up for tonight is that she tried to say, do you want to look at body camera to refresh your recollection? And I'll point out that we haven't seen any body camera in this case yet. We know body camera exists because we've gotten it in a records release, but it hasn't been played yet. And I wonder if that's, again, tactical by the state as not to maybe elongate some testimony. And especially when you have witnesses who are speaking to everything, it might just be a little more expedited. So we haven't seen any. And I think that was just interesting to have her again, we've seen her, the last week was the first time we really saw her try to bring her own paperwork into the picture here. And I think she's just trying to do things that make her seem more, like a lawyer in court. So, want to do this to refresh your recollection. And even Detective Blair was like, I guess if we need to, but that would, delay the process here. So kind of just those interactions, again, I don't think bode her well. And one other thing I want to point out before, we wrap up tonight is that there was one point where, there was a sidebar and Lori, they come back from it and Lori brings up a private investigator that Brandon hired. We aren't expecting to hear from this private investigator. We've actually interviewed him here at 12 News, so we knew he wasn't going to testify in this case, or at least he hadn't been called to. But seemingly was very helpful on Brandon's side of things when, they were originally getting going from here. And Lori, starts to ask those questions and goes down, that path there. And at one point, the state objects and, the judge gets in and one point Lori says, on what grounds? And, he basically says, you could be opening a door here if you keep, going down this way. And we've heard that phrase before. Opening a door could mean bringing in some of her past that you would think she would not want to be brought in here. So I, would be remiss if we didn't bring up that moment from the day, because that was, the first essentially that we saw of that today. But how did you think of the rest of his testimony? Or I guess
I thought it was,
we are still waiting for the rest of the cross. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, we still have to hear more. And I wonder if that not seeing that body cam is actually a strategy by the prosecution to not reinforce some of that information. Instead, being able to ask exactly what they want to ask, but not having that play out. Having Brandon talk about the paintball gun. Not that they're trying to hide it, but there's really no benefit to them to play that, but instead to just get those officers to talk about what they did find to be true. And just to explain that there was body camera, but really it doesn't help them to see it. So we'll have to see if that's how it stays, if that stays true, or if they actually do put that out there. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I'll say,
but you're right.
Yeah, I'll add to that quickly, Andrea, is that as someone who has reviewed the body camera that was released to the media in this case, it is hours and hours and hours, and it's coming from multiple different responding officers. So it can be confusing to kind of overlay all of that together. And I agree, I think it would make things a lot longer when you can ask specific questions of the people who were involved.
Right. And those questions are going to continue again tomorrow morning. We will be back tomorrow morning, court back in session for day 4 of this trial against Lori-Vallow Daybell. And Erica will be inside the courtroom, and we will take you inside the courtroom right here tomorrow evening. We hope to see you then.